Well, lovely. So, hello, everybody. My name is Nasser, and it's a privilege to welcome you all on behalf of the journal Identities, Casey at Lancaster, and Sociology at the University of Glasgow, to this, which is our concluding anniversary lecture of Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power. If you've been to any of the other lectures in this series before, you will know that this year marks our 30th anniversary of the journal, and that in our very first issue, the founding editor, Professor Nina Glick-Schiller, set out the case for identities on the grounds that cultural politics, she argued, had emerged as a means of either maintaining or resisting domination, and in a way that demanded fresh and dedicated analysis. Now, some 30 years later, spanning methodological approaches, geographical registers, intellectual traditions, Identities has done that. It's established itself as a place for sustained interdisciplinary analysis. And in that respect, we're honoured that the third speaker in our trilogy of public lectures helping us to mark this milestone is Dr. Jean Beaman. Dr. Beaman is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Graduate Centre of the City University of New York, CNUY. Her research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on race and ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state violence in both France and the United States. She is author of the award-winning Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, which is published with the University of California Press in 2017, as well as numerous other articles and book chapters. She was recently a fellow for the Centre for Advanced Study in Behavioural Sciences at Stanford University, and she is a co-PI for the Mellon Foundation Sawyer Seminar Grant Series, Race, Precarity and Privilege Migration in a Global Context. But no less importantly, she is an associate editor of the journal, Identities, Global Studies and Power, so it's fitting that she kind of take our lecture series home. The title of her talk today is Freedom Dreams in France, Notes on State Violence in France, Colonial Continuities and Global Racism and Antiracism. And Jean, whenever you're ready, it's over to you.
So thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I want to especially thank Nasser, Aaron Winter, and Michaela for all their support and for this invitation that I'm quite humbled by. It's been really an honor to work with you on identities as an associate editor. So even before I joined the editorial board for this journal has been formative to and supportive of my own research and thinking throughout my career. One of my first publications related to my first book was published in Identities, the first of 2 articles. And I'm honored and very humbled to give this lecture as part of the Identities anniversary series, following lectures by Claire Alexander and Catherine Hall. So I realize that I'm giving this lecture in the midst of proverbial, yet nonetheless important to mention, quote unquote, difficult times, including here in the United States where I'm based, as we move towards another step forward towards fascism with the pending second presidential term of Donald Trump and the promises of mass deportation amid an ongoing genocide of Palestinians funded by and supported by the United States, as well as growing backlash and repression towards naming and addressing issues of race, racism, and anti-Blackness, both in the United States and globally, and the mainstreaming of the far right and state repression taking various forms worldwide. So the title of my lecture is Freedom Dreams in France, Notes on State Violence in France, Colonial Continuities and Global Racism and Anti-Racism. And it comes out of much thinking and research related to the book I'm currently writing, entitled Suspect Citizenship, Racism and State Violence in France and the World with Stanford University Press. So in this book, I present a framework of suspect citizenship, which I argue is a capacious way of understanding how plural and post-colonial societies render certain populations as automatically suspect or suspicious based on their ethno-racial assignment. Among other things, I'm interested in how colonial and racial logics persist in this present post-colonial period through an examination of state violence and mobilization against it in France, as well as how state violence and the movement against it is also global in scope. So the title here is, of course, a nod to Robin Kelly's 2003 Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. And I use it here and come back to it a bit later to refer to how populations racialized as Black in France resist the violence that the state enacts and envision a better France and a better world. On June 16th, 2017, Yurumano Yanez, a Minnesota police officer, was acquitted in the death of Philando Castile, pictured here in July 2016. So Castile, a 32-year-old Black American, was pulled over as he drove with his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, and their 4-year-old daughter. As Yanez shot Castile multiple times, his girlfriend streamed the aftermath of the death live on Facebook. Despite the numerous deaths of Black and Brown individuals at the hands of police in the United States that went unpunished, Castile's death, or at least partially because of this live video, seemed like it might be different. Yet it was the same. No justice for Castile and his family. So I thought about this, or I learned about Yanez's acquittal late on the night of the 16th while I was in Paris conducting research. So barely having time to process this horrific news, the next morning I woke up early to participate in a commemoration and demonstration for the 10-year anniversary of the death of Limine Dieng in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, not far from the Père Lachaise Cemetery, the famous cemetery where Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, and Jim Morrison, among others, are buried. So on June 17th, 2007, Limine Dieng, a 25-year-old of Senegalese origin, whose sister Ramada is pictured here, died following a struggle with multiple police officers in the 20th arrondissement. Limine was restrained face down on the street with his hands tied behind his back and his feet strapped together. He was then taken to a police van, and by the time he arrived at the station, he was no longer breathing. The medical report stated that he had died of asphyxiation, yet his family and friends want a full investigation, as well as punishment for the officers involved. And this image on the right is a mural of Limine Dieng. So as I participated in this demonstration for Limine Dieng, as well as for other victims of state violence in France, I thought about the parallels between state violence in both societies. Following Lamine's death, his sister, Ramada Dieng, and some friends and family members formed a collectif Vivole, which loosely translates as Stolen Lives, which, among other things, holds a march throughout the 20th arrondissement each year on June 17th, demanding justice. He wants this to be a worldwide network connecting what's happening in France with what's happening in the United States and other societies. Through this collectif, she and other activists align with friends and family members of other victims of police violence and also hold yearly commemorative demonstrations each June on the anniversary of Limine's death. During this commemorative march, Ramada recounts the events leading up to Limine's death, leads spots at the exact spot where he died, as well as allows family members and friends of other victims to recount their stories. So this particular demonstration for the 10th anniversary of Limine's death was much larger than in previous years. Earlier that morning, we watched a documentary with footage of Limine's friends and relatives discussing his life and death, as well as his miscarriage of justice. Speaking solemnly into the camera, Ramada said before bursting into tears, quote, "The police kill us. They don't police us. We've been fighting this for 10 years. We need to know what the truth is," end quote. At the subsequent press conference, she clarified that rather than being punished, the officers involved have since been promoted. One young Black woman at the press conference then asked what her spirit was like these days. "More determined than ever," she replied. And I want to come back to this sort of framing of more determined than ever later. So later that day, a crowd of more than 400 people marched for over 3 hours in the surrounding neighborhood. I helped carry a banner with the name and face of Limine and other victims of police violence, which was the previous slide. Periodically, we stopped so that family members of other victims of police violence could give their testimonials and their calls for justice for their own loved ones. We stopped at the corner in the 20th arrondissement where Limine was killed, and his father led a prayer in Arabic. Throughout the afternoon, we shouted chants, including "Justice for Limine" or "Justice for Limine." The police assassinate, the justice system acquits them. And Zaid and Bono, "We don't forget you, we don't pardon your deaths," which I'll come back to in a second. While holding banners and signs that read, "Who will protect us from the police? Police are everywhere and justice is nowhere." And this photo is from various signs used during that particular protest. So once when Ramada and I were meeting in a park not too far from where her brother was killed, she explained the contours of this issue. She says, quote, "Police violence in France really is a racial question. It is racism of the state, because when you look at the list of victims, you see that essentially more than 90% are Blacks and Arabs. The remaining 10% are activists or militants, Roma, and what we say in quotation marks as accidents. Whites only die by accident because they are not targeted, they are not the profile. There's a kind of profile for police violence, and the profile of victims is always the same profile. It's always young Black men between 20 and 40 years old, and Maghreban or North Africans as well, between 20 and 40 years old," end quote. So Ramada sees being a woman as an asset in the struggle, as women are also subjected to identity checks like men. And she sees her brother as an example of any Black or Maghreban man in France that this could happen to. And during this same conversation and meeting with Ramada, she noted how frequently the same police officers were coming by the park where we were hanging out, harassing the same youth they had spoken to only an hour or two beforehand, speaking both to the sort of quotidianness of police harassment and the social function it ultimately plays. Later in that same conversation, she told me that in the United States, state violence is much worse as there are many more victims here. Yet she says, quote, "This happens in all Western societies because it comes from the state. The state is racist," end quote. That a French person could make such a statement but belies supposedly colorblind ethos upon which France rest. And this image here on the right is from a poster advertising the 2015 Limine demonstration. And hopefully you recognize the image of Malcolm X, and the translation is, "Our objective is," oh, I can't see it. Total total freedom, total justice, total equality by all means necessary. And then the second quote is, "Truth is on the side of the oppressed." And then hopefully also you recognize the references to Ferguson, Detroit, and Baltimore, all cities with, quote unquote, high profile incidents of police violence against Black Americans. So let me so stepping back a bit, let me briefly discuss this colorblind ethos and the context of French republicanism, which situates my overall research, including my thinking on the violence enacted against Limine Dieng, the mobilization against it, and the connections with police violence or state violence against Black populations in the United States and elsewhere. So French republicanism emphasizes the relationship between individuals and the state over any other group categorization or identity. Being French is supposed to supersede any other identification, such as linguistic, religious, or ethnic. Race is not considered a legitimate category by the state. It is not measured in the French census. So talking about race or even using the word race exacerbates racism. So it goes to sort of everyday thinking. And in fact, the United States is often characterized as an example of the dangers that can occur when such difference is acknowledged, which becomes relevant when considering these global connections as they relate to state violence. France, therefore, imagines and continually constructs itself as colorblind or race neutral. This is reflected, for example, in how the French can celebrate African American expatriates such as James Baldwin, Chester Himes, or Josephine Baker, who were all supposedly supposed to feel freer in France than they ever could in a racist America. Yet, despite the Republican emphasis on the renunciation of ethno-racial categorization, many scholars, including here, I'm thinking of Sue Peabody, Todd Shepard, and Jennifer Bottin, among others, have argued that France has long relied on ethno-racial boundaries in constructing its national identity. Since France has a long history of colonial slavery, colonialism, and related subsequent migration to the metropole, it is necessary to understand how individuals who are descendants of these structures fare in contemporary French society, as well as how states, quote unquote, manage descendants of formerly colonized subjects. Relatedly, while anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, France provides a site for understanding its continuities both during and following colonial rule, and for how colonial logics of inherent inferiority and dehumanization get expressed in a post-colonial context. So this has also been reflected in scholarly treatments on these issues in France and Europe more broadly. For example, Franz Fanon wrote in Black Skin, White Mask of how the European has a fixed concept of the Negro, and therefore how Blacks in France are not seen as of France. We can point to French scholar Pape Nadier, who's discussed how Blacks in France are paradoxically and simultaneously visible and invisible, and Trika Keaton, who's argued that France's race blindness is coupled with race-based assumptions, which lead to a consciousness of race. In my own research, I extend Omni and Wynon's framework of the racial product to France. Among other things, this framework allows me to consider how people who are marked as different and inferior without state-level categorization. David Theo Goldberg's framework of racial Europeanization is also helpful, focusing on how race is seen as a problem everywhere but in Europe, where it is often framed as exceptional or related to phenomena of the past, such as the Holocaust. Europe, therefore, becomes an example of quote unquote political racistness. I'm also heavily influenced by Stephen Spall's conceptualization of Black Europe, which articulates how Black populations throughout Europe are seen as quote unquote permanent strangers, and Nicholas Gigenova's conceptualization of Blackness as, quote, the racialized sociopolitical category that can be understood to encompass the full spectrum of social identities produced as specifically non-white, end quote. One of the things that's clear here is how race and ethnicity are taboo to discuss, yet as my research and that of many others has shown, omnipresent in the lives of individuals marked as non-white, and as a structure dictating belonging and non-belonging in society. And this photo is from an anti-racist protest in 2018, and hopefully you recognize the image of figures, Rosa Parks, and the text translates to, "Who will protect us from the police, excuse me. Police are everywhere and justice is nowhere." So now I want to say just a bit about the contours of state violence as I'm conceiving it for this project. So anthropologist Didier Fasson has argued that the police acts as an agent of the state to maintain ethno-racial boundaries in the absence of state-level categories. In other words, the police enact the real and symbolic violence of the state or do its quote-unquote violence work, as Mahida Teher terms it. So here I'm using the term state violence, not just to refer to specific killings by the police, but also as a way to understand the different ways that the state, including through the police, is involved in the systematic devaluing of certain individuals across various domains of society. In doing so, I used Ruth Russo Gilmore's definition of racism as, quote, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, end quote. Such a definition of racism helps to clarify the relationship between ethno-racial assignment, the state, and the violence it enacts. Anthropologist Paul Silverstein has argued that identity checks by the police, or les contrôles d'identité, are a kind of citizenship surveillance of predominantly Black and Maghreb origin individuals. French political scientists Fabien Jobard and René Lévy have demonstrated how they disproportionately target visible minorities. A 2012 Human Rights Watch report found that the majority of Black and Maghreb origin individuals reported identity checks by the police as a major problem. They are 6 to 8 times more likely than whites to experience them. As to actual deaths by the police, estimates vary widely, but one estimate by Bastamag, which is an independent French media source, states that between 1977 and 2022, about 861 people have died at the hands of the police. So beyond focusing, but by focusing beyond, specific event incidents of state violence to examining the broader specter of state violence, I demonstrate the work that state violence does within a society. It conditions certain populations to be suspect or forever on the margins of that society. In other words, the raw numbers or statistics of police brutality only tell part of the story. Considering state violence in a broader scope reveals how it is not exceptional, but rather part of a broader structural condition in which profiling and surveillance are normalized and quotidian. And this image is from a 2018 demonstration for Lin Jiang, and the French translates to mean cops assassin and the nice cops sort of watch or sort of just watch. So throughout my fieldwork, many have made direct connections between ongoing practices of policing harassment and hypersurveillance by the police with the same patterns and practices in former French colonies and present overseas départements, and reminded me that what I was studying and witnessing was therefore not a new phenomenon. They are therefore responding to state violence that is not new, but rather a sort of extension or new manifestation of the violence under French colonial rule. For example, historian Jennifer Boiton has demonstrated how throughout France's empire in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, various colonized populations were labeled quote unquote suspicious or quote unquote undesirable by French officials, including when they migrated to the metropole. And decolonial and anti-colonial activists were heavily monitored and surveilled by the French police. Therefore, one function of suspect citizenship is how it maintains these colonial continuities, including which individuals are questioned, doubted, and distrusted. For example, Franco is a 47-year-old activist who was born in Guadeloupe and came to mainland France when he was 2 years old. When we first met in a small cafe near the movie theater in Les Halles shopping center, he explained these continuities and how they relate to state violence. He says, quote, "What's happening now in France is reproducing what happened in the colonies. Post-colonialism is just a myth. What we have now is neocolonialism. Nothing has changed, just the ideas are the same. This is a bigger problem than just police violence. It is part of neocolonialism. Police violence is a symptom of what really hurts people. We have to fight against what's in people's heads, what never left. We have to decolonize our minds. It's the only way towards a total liberation of Black people," end quote. So Franco grew up in various banlieues or suburban outskirts, around Paris, and is active with a number of collectives fighting against state violence and police harassment, as well as what he terms quote unquote negrophobia. He often helps lead demonstration for victims of state violence, including Liming Jiang, and also leads trainings to empower others about how to respond when they are stopped by the police or les contrôles d'identité, including the rights to film such encounters with the police using their phones and post those videos to social media. So in fall 2021, Franco was fined about 1,500 euros for spray painting a statue of Jean-Baptiste Colbert outside of the National Assembly in Paris with red paint reading "State Negrophobia" in June 2020, which is the photo here. So Colbert famously wrote the Code Noir or Black Code, which among other things defines slavery and its conditions in France's overseas territories. Franco publicly described this gesture, which was condemned by French President Macron, as an inappropriate way to protest, as a political act responding to the French state's anti-Black racism. So Franco later explained to me that he was motivated to become an anti-racist activist, partly because of the 2005 uprisings in France. So on October 27, 2005, Saïd Benna, a 17-year-old of Tunisian origin, Beno Traoré, 15-year-old of Malayan origin, pictured here, were electrocuted at a substation as they fled police in the Parisian banlieue of Clichy-sous-Bois. They are allegedly trying to avoid a contrôle d'identité or identity check by the police. So under current laws, police officers have jurisdiction to stop individuals seen as quote unquote suspicious ask for their identification and whereabouts, and comb through their belongings. And such identity checks have often led to or included harassment and brutality by the police, including leading to death. Therefore, in running for their lives, Said and Bona also ran towards their deaths. Outrage about their deaths and the lack of acknowledgement thereof by the police led to uprisings throughout France's banlieues for a few weeks. National and international media heavily covered these uprisings, featuring lots of images of heavily armed police and of cars and buildings on fire. Then President Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency. And then Interior Minister and then later President Nicolas Sarkozy called the individuals involved in the uprisings racailles, or scum, and suggested cleaning the streets of the banlieues with a crachir, or a brand of a high-pressure water hose. The police officers involved in the deaths of Said and Bona were cleared of all charges related to their deaths over a decade later. So at the time of these uprisings, when I was in graduate school, the popular discourse was that these disaffected, unemployed, and underemployed youth involved in the uprisings needed to better integrate themselves into French society. It was youth like Said and Bona who were framed as immigrants rather than as French-born citizens. They were the problem, not the state of France itself. While these uprisings received much national and international media attention, what was often missed in the discourse at the time was the role of police violence or state violence in creating a context for the deaths of these two ethno-racial minority youth and the subsequent uprisings. So in another conversation I had with Franco, he explained to me that, quote, "We're the only ones ever called racailles, or scum, not the white protesters or people from the left," end quote. In fact, Franco was one of many interlocutors I encountered during my fieldwork who mentioned how important these 2005 uprisings were for driving them to become activists, particularly as many of the conditions that led to Said and Bona's deaths have not changed. In this way, the 2005 uprisings were a quote-unquote critical juncture, or a distinctive moment in which different ideologies and arrangements were forged, making it difficult to return to a period before such changes. To provide another example, this is Assa Traoré, who is leading the movement for justice for her brother, Adama Traoré, and she's pictured here under a photo of her brother. So Adama Traoré was a 24-year-old Black construction worker who died after being arrested in a banlieue north of Paris in July 2016. The police first claimed that he had died of a heart attack and then later said he had had a severe infection, and there have been numerous explanations given ever since. Since his death, which one US media account termed quote-unquote Francis Ferguson, there have been numerous demonstrations demanding justice for Adama Traoré, including one every year on the anniversary of his death, and this photo is from one demonstration in 2018. So Asa and her family are alleging lack of assistance and willful neglect by the police as both contributing to his death, especially since Adama had no chronic health issues prior to his death. Before her brother's death, she was working as a teacher's assistant at another banlieue north of Paris. She has since written 2 books, the sales of which she uses to seek justice for her brother. This includes paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers. She has 17 total siblings who have been in jail for various periods since Adama's death. She has stated publicly that her family has been under attack by the state ever since they contested the official explanation for Adama's death, sort of explaining why her brothers have been arrested. Asa regularly gives talks about state violence and her brother's death, not just in France, but all over the world, and has received support from various celebrities, including French rapper Maccabi and activist and scholar Angela Davis. When she and I first met in 2017, she told me that she sees this cause as not just about justice for her brother, but for all forgotten populations in France, including residents of the Quartier Populaire or working class neighborhoods, who know the police only as a quote unquote invading force. Here's just one example of how activists frame and understand state violence as not just about specific killings, but also as a broader indicator of how visible minorities like herself are systematically devalued. Once, when I met with her, as she was signing copies of her first book at the offices of Soul, her publisher in Paris, she explained, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I've been controlled in these quartiers or neighborhoods." She's talking about the identity control checks. What's happening is France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that, end quote. So here also speaking not just of the sort of pervasiveness of state violence, here the prevalence of identity checks, but also to the way that the people like her slain brother, like her, are not understood as part of France or even as fully human. Her words also speak to the tensions inherent in French republicanism, as some differences in France are seen as meaningful and others are not. And this image is a photo I took at a 2019 demonstration for Adama Traore, and you can hopefully see the Black Lives Matter text. And then on the bottom, it reads "Silence, France kills," and then also includes the death of Adama Traore, or the date of the death, rather, of Adama Traore. So while also and other visible minorities in France had paid attention to both state violence against Black Americans and the growing Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, this does not mean that they automatically transferred this movement to the French context, as they also had critiques of what the movement was doing or could do. However, especially since the 2020 death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests and demonstrations throughout much of Europe, also has become a face, if not the face, of France's present anti-racist movement and has been framed as such in French, US, and other international media. For example, also led a massive demonstration outside of the High Court in Paris of more than 20,000 protesters against police violence, including the death of her own brother, Adama, and George Floyd's murder, as shown in this image here. Several protest signs invoked Black Lives Matter and quote unquote, "I can't breathe," the last words of both George Floyd and Adama Traore. In a later interview with the French magazine Antiracism, Asa said, quote, "When George Floyd died, that's our brother. They, Floyd and Traore, died the same way. I recognize myself in Black Lives Matter. We are all Black Lives Matter. A common issue is racial discrimination. Here as over there, it is the Blacks, the non-whites who are being killed," end quote. I suggest, therefore, that we should not assume a natural or automatic resonance in connection with Black Lives Matter, but more importantly, pay attention to the nuances and tensions by which visible minorities pay attention to incidents of state violence in France, as well as in other societies, but also have their own critiques about movement ideology and tactics. So they are not parroting whatever comes out of the United States, but rather thinking strategically what it means to do so. And I think Asa's anti-racist work, both within and outside of France, speaks to this. In considering how visible minorities challenge and resist their suspect citizenship, it is also necessary to consider both local specificities and how these struggles travel beyond nation-state boundaries. As I've argued elsewhere, what we might consider Black Lives Matter in Europe builds upon and connects to present and past anti-racist mobilization across Europe. It involves challenging the denial of race and racism, naming racism, fighting state violence against ethno-racial minorities, and forcing Europe to grapple with its own history of slavery and colonialism, as well as acknowledging and affirming the presence of Black Europeans across the continent. Black Lives Matter in Europe challenges a European exceptionalism with regards to race and racism, and challenges Black Europeans' frequent designation as permanent outsiders within Europe. It both addresses the local specificities of anti-Black racism in different European societies and travels beyond the boundaries of the nation state to emphasize the global connections regarding what it means to be racialized as Black around the world. This is not new, but it is crucial to pay attention to in order to better understand the realities of Black populations, not just in Europe, but around the world. So let me circle back to my framework of suspect citizenship to make sense of state violence, colonial continuities, and global racism and anti-racism. So here I'm examining suspect citizenship at the nexus between boundaries of belonging and non-belonging in society, anti-racism at a macro level, and activism against state violence or police violence in France. So my use of the sort of so the citizenship and suspect citizenship builds upon long-standing debates on the racialized and differential nature of modern citizenship. Speaking here of scholars like Gurminder Barma, Letty Volpe, David Fitzgerald, and Evelyn Nakano Glenn, among others. I push this further by considering whether or not ethno-racial minorities are ever capable of being included into the polity. My use of suspect in suspect citizenship builds upon extant research on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, and how Muslims are increasingly surveilled and constructed as quote unquote suspect communities, as Francesco Ragazzi has shown in his research. Yet I extend this by arguing that this ongoing construction of suspicion is broader than counterterrorism in Muslim communities. Rather, it is constructed against and resisted by all non-white populations. So I offer suspect citizenship as another way of considering how non-belonging is produced, building off of the work of Anna Cordove and Gorgi Yoredale, as well as thinking about the precariousness and liminality of full societal belonging. In this way, I suggest that visible minorities in France are quote unquote permanent minorities, per Maou Madami's framework, who has argued that colonial modernity led to the making of permanent minorities in modern nation states, and quote unquote permanent strangers, per Stephen Small, who has argued that Black people throughout Europe wear their passports on their faces. In this way, suspect citizenship also clarifies the relationship between non-belonging and anti-Blackness, as I demonstrate how they are co-created and co-produced. I present an empirically produced theory of the production of non-belonging and its relation to whiteness and white supremacy. I argue that therefore, that it's not one's legal citizenship status that marks boundaries of inclusion and belonging, but rather one's permanent construction as suspect. The suspicion locates them on the margins of mainstream society and renders their incorporation and inclusion as impossible. And this image here is a mural of Adama Traoré and George Floyd in Saint-Denis, a banlieue department just north of Paris in 2020. And this is a Getty Images photo. I did not take this photo. So Amy Weinald, in their framework of the racial project, argued that we are compelled, quote unquote, compelled to think racially, meaning that in order to oppose racism, we must first acknowledge race. So racism can be evident in practices and discourses of state violence, which create and reinforce suspect citizenship. The state therefore activates ethno-racial boundaries through incidents such as the deaths of Zaid or Bona or Lamin or Adoma. The challenge to combating state violence is doing so under the constraints of French Republican ideology. Ethno-racial distinctions remain salient in French society, yet claims of recognition as French are forever thwarted in the face of these constraints. Struggles against state violence have to also be anti-racist struggles, even though there's no language, literally or figuratively, to combat racism within France. So when activists are sort of connecting their struggles with similar incidents of state violence elsewhere, they are doing so in a context in which there are no quote unquote Black lives. And this photo is one I took of a banner at a 2019 demonstration for Adama Traoré. And these are all names of different victims of state violence and the ages at which they were killed. So where are the quote unquote freedom dreams in this context? Besides referencing Kelly and of course the Black radical tradition, I also want to highlight the transformative scholarship of Sophie Niang, whose theorizing of Black world-making practices in France is an invitation to consider how France's visible minorities refuse the problematic binary of French versus Black or French versus Arab. And this connects well to the long-standing tradition of Black feminist theorizing, both within France and globally, conceptualizing what it means to be racialized as Black, both within and beyond the nation state and its borders. And this is not new. So here I highlight the Nardell sisters, Paulette and Jane, pictured here, whose writings in the Clement Salon and their Clement Salon in Paris were the precursor to the Negritude movement, even if those contributions had been ignored or dismissed. Their salon was a critical space for discussion of a quote-unquote racial consciousness, Black politics and international solidarity. It included such figures as Aimé Césaire and Léopold Ségur. Moreover, as scholar Annette Joseph Gabriel has argued, Black French women have long engaged in transnational practices in their affirmation of Black liberation and struggle towards full societal belonging for Black populations, or what she has termed, quote unquote, decolonial citizenship, and invites us to consider what our genealogy and history of decolonization might look like if we centered Black women versus rendering them in supporting roles. Other French Afrofeminist groups, including La Coordination des Femmes Noires or Le Mouvement pour la Défense des Droits de la Femme Noire, and activists and artists, including Rakaya Diallo, Mem Fatou Niang, and Amadine Gay, among others, have built upon these earlier foundational thinkers to insist upon the relevance of Black feminism and anti-racist struggles more generally in France and the global connections to their activism amid strong hostility and backlash to their work. One example is the Moissy Collectif, whose manifesto states, quote, "Our Black feminism is a political and collective response to a racist, sexist, heteropatriarchal, and capitalist system, and founded in the history of women and Black feminists who have organized and participated in the fight for freedom and emancipation while contributing to the construction of Black feminist thought in France, Africa, the Caribbean, and throughout the Black diaspora," end quote. In this way, we can see how Black feminist and intersectional activism have both been integral to analyses of racism and anti-racism in France and globally. And I want to just be clear that I'm not suggesting that these are all activists in the same way or identifying the same way, or even see themselves as parts of the same struggles per se, but rather I invoke them here to highlight a genealogy and history of anti-racist and Black feminist theorizing. So in short, I find hope in these ongoing anti-racist and Black feminists, and this ongoing anti-racist and Black feminist work. So suspect citizenship, I argue, as a framework matters because when we say, for example, that French republicanism or France itself is inherently racist or white supremacist, we need to examine how that inherence is secured. And I've tried to argue here that suspect citizenship is how it's secured. In other words, certain populations are rendered forever suspect, and this structures belonging versus non-belonging and how individuals resist that. The specter of state violence structures the lives of visible minorities or non-white individuals in France, conditioning them as forever marginalized. Suspect citizenship is an example of what the late Charles Mills refers to as a quote-unquote racial contract, clarifying how white supremacy is maintained through distinctions between full and subordinate personhood. The specter of state violence illustrates how citizenship and societal belonging extend beyond questions of legal citizenship status. The visible minorities rely on an idea of citizenship, in this context, a Republican ideal thereof, to make claims to the state and contest what the state enacts. Suspect citizenship produces and reaffirms these boundaries of belonging and non-belonging, and who can and cannot belong in society. And this is directly related to both to the European colonial project, which reordered and remapped much of the world, and the simultaneous anti-Blackness and dismissal of racism throughout France and broader Europe. For example, a sociologist, Celeste Currington, argues in her forthcoming analysis of African descendant women in Portugal, she says, quote, "A larger ontological structure of anti-Blackness facilitates the racialized exclusion around belonging encountered by Black people day to day," end quote. In this way, the ongoing racial logics of difference forged under colonial rule provide a context for the use of state violence and police harassment in structuring and enforcing belonging versus non-belonging. I also see suspect citizenship in line with recent calls for decolonial approaches to our ways of thinking as sociologists, and in conversation with the expanding fields of Black Europe, attending to how we cannot understand dynamics in present day Europe outside of recognition of colonial imperial histories and the indispensable role of mobilization by Black populations against these structures. In other words, documenting suspect citizenship is akin to presenting a history, quote unquote, from below, or a new way of seeing and making sense of difference in post-colonial plural societies. As one of my interlocutors, Gregory, explained to me, quote, racism is in France's esprit. Minds have not been decolonized, end quote. Or as sociologist Stephen Small has proclaimed, quote, we are here because you were there, end quote. Said and Bona were technically French. They were born in France, but simultaneous with their status as French citizens was their status as suspect. And understanding the relationship between the two is crucial for understanding how racism operates and how white supremacy is maintained in plural post-colonial societies. I suggest here that suspect citizenship is a necessary feature of modern liberal societies, including, but of course not limited to France, as some populations are automatically included within society and other populations are treated as precarious and excluded from ever belonging to society. This goes beyond inclusion to society to consideration of whose entry and rightful place in society is actively denied. As sociologist Cecilia Minabar has introduced the framework of legal liminality to demonstrate the multivariate ways in bureaucratic systems that migrants face between being undocumented and documented. Here I suggest that suspect citizenship clarifies how this liminality and precariousness persist even for legal or rightful citizenship, or citizens, excuse me, as the state remains engaged in making people feel out of place. To give another example, in the United States, sociologist Barbara Combs has used the framework of quote unquote bodies out of place to convey how Black Americans are reinforced that they do not belong and experience quote unquote out of placeness by white Americans. Whether when they call the police when Black Americans appear to be engaged in wrongdoing, or when the police themselves enact violence upon Black Americans. This is a broader way of considering how Black populations are always outside of the category of substantive citizens, and therefore not entitled to the full benefits of substantive citizenship. As Combs demonstrates the quotidianness of anti-Blackness in a post-civil rights movement context, I'm interested in how this operates in a post-colonial context, as anti-Blackness and non-belonging are continually mapped onto colonial subjects and their descendants. France, therefore, is a case of one society in which structures, such as slavery or colonialism, have changed, but the underlying logic supporting them have not. Suspect citizenship offers a new way of considering ongoing practices of colonialism following the end of formal colonial rule. And so I'm ultimately arguing that we need a more expansive understanding of the relationship between citizenship, societal belonging, and racism, and suspect citizenship helps gets us there. So I will end by invoking James Baldwin, whose writing and thinking on racism, both the United States and in France, has greatly influenced my own. And this is a photo of him in Paris. And I will also invoke this photo I took of a young boy with a t-shirt reading Black Lives Matter at a demonstration for Palestinian liberation at the Place de la Nation in Paris this past summer. So throughout my fieldwork, both from sort of my dissertation research I began many, many years ago to this current book that I'm writing, parts of which I've shared here, France's visible minorities have made clear connections between their plight and the plight of Palestinians in the occupied territories. This is the context under which I'm conducting this research and writing this book, and under which visible minorities struggle for recognition. Beyond the context of France, Baldwin has warned us of the dangers that will occur when white supremacy, or as he notes, this quote unquote racial nightmare, as he put it in 1963, is not contested, challenged, or rebuked. It will be quote unquote the fire next time. Thank you.